The variable text, a logical audit of the Quran. To begin an audit of any foundational claim, we must establish a baseline of truth. In logic, this is the law of identity. A equals A. For a text to be deemed divine and immutable, it must remain invariant across time, history, and internal logic. If a claim contradicts established external data or its own internal framework, the standard of invariance is compromised. Axiom, our analytical auditor, stands before a blank slate, preparing to measure the weight of a text that claims to be the final, perfect word. The audit moves to the historical record of the first century. Surah 4-157 claims that the crucifixion of Jesus was an illusion, a deception where someone else was substituted. However, Axiom observes a conflict. The historical consensus among secular and contemporary scholars is that the crucifixion is one of the most certain facts of the ancient world. Beside Axiom, Codex, a figure representing the historical record, holds a scroll that details the Roman and Jewish accounts that do not align with the sudden substitution theory proposed centuries later. We test the internal consistency of prophetic protection. Surah 69, 44-46 states that if the prophet were to invent false sayings, his life vein or aorta would be severed. Axiom cross-references this with Sahih Bukhari 4428, where, in his final moments, the prophet describes the pain of a poisoned meal from Khaybar as feeling as though his aorta was being cut. The linguistic overlap between the divine threat and the reported cause of death creates a logical tension that Axiom must log as a critical data point. The audit examines the incident of the Quranic, or the satanic verses. Historical biographers like Ibn Ishaq recorded an instance where verses praising pagan goddesses were allegedly recited and later retracted as satanic interpolations. Codex examines the fragments of early biographical accounts, noting how the admission of temporary fallibility in the transmission process introduces a variable into what is claimed to be an invariable channel of communication. Language is not a static object, it is a living evolution. The Quran claims to be a clear Arabic text, yet Axiom and Codex observe that the earliest manuscripts were written in Razm, a skeletal script lacking the dots, ijam, and vowels, tashkil, necessary for precise meaning. It was not until decades later that scholars added these markers to standardize the reading. This transition from a vague skeletal structure to a fixed text demonstrates a human, iterative process of linguistic refinement rather than a singular finished descent. Mathematical reality provides a rigid test for any legal framework. In the inheritance laws of Surah 4, the prescribed shares for various heirs can sometimes sum to more than 1.0, a total of 100%. Axiom reviews the Minbariya case, where the Caliph Ali had to implement a mathematical adjustment to resolve the surplus. This adjustment proves that the original text, when applied literally, resulted in a functional error that required human intervention to correct. The audit turns to the physical world. Surah 18-86 describes a traveler finding the sun setting into a muddy spring. While often interpreted metaphorically today, Codex notes that early commentators and the literal phrasing reflect an ancient geocentric cosmology. In a logical audit, the shift from a literal spring to a metaphorical perspective is noted as an adaptive interpretation used to align the text with modern planetary science. Ethical systems are evaluated on their consistency. The concept of naskh, or abrogation, allows later verses to cancel out earlier ones. Axiom and Codex observe how the peaceful, pluralistic verses of the early Meccan period were superseded by the more militant verses of the sword during the Medinan period. This situational ethics suggests a text that responds to the changing political fortunes of its speaker, rather than a timeless, universal moral code. Finally, we audit the claim of retrospective miracles. Claims that the text contains modern embryological secrets are tested against the works of the Greek physician Galen, who wrote centuries earlier. Axiom notes that the descriptions of clots and chewed flesh align precisely with the prevailing and partially incorrect Greek medical theories of the time. Similarly, the domestic exemptions in Surah 33, 50-51, which grant the prophet unique marriage privileges, appear as functional adaptations to personal circumstances rather than universal laws. The audit is complete. By testing the text against the standard of invariance, Axiom and Codex conclude that the data points to a, quote, variable text. It is a document that evolved linguistically, adjusted mathematically, and adapted ethically to its historical context. Rather than an immutable divine monolith, the logic of history and science reveals a deeply human construct, a mirror of the era in which it was born, reflecting the knowledge, struggles, and aspirations of its time.